Good afternoon. Yes. Hello. So, welcome to all students. She's announcing it. Starts now. Yes. Okay, so welcome everybody, students, colleagues, friends, to the 9th event in our Palestine in Focus series here at the International Institute of Social History. My name is Francisca de Haan and I'm a fellow here at the Institute, which is both a major library and archive and a research institute with a focus on global labor history. The Institute was established in 1935 and this fall celebrates its 90th anniversary. The reason to establish the Institute was the political context of the time. Both Stalin's oppression and Nazi and fascist regimes in almost the whole of Central, Eastern and Southern Europe posed a direct threat not just to the political opponents of these regimes, but also to their papers, their documentary legacy. Professor Postumus, who later also founded the NIOD, the Netherlands Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies, in 1935, with the support of a labor movement-related bank and the municipality of Amsterdam, managed to set up the International Institute of Social History, which indeed salvaged crucial European socialist collections. In later decades, it also expanded its scope beyond Europe and the United States. Today, we are honored to have Afaf Jabiri as guest speaker in our Palestine in Focus series. And this made me wonder, at the time, the 1935 celebration, made me wonder what happened in Palestine in 1935. One answer came last night when I attended the closing event of the Amsterdam version of Getuigen voor Gaza, Witnessing for Gaza, in which volunteers for 5 days and nights read out the names, age and gender of the registered deaths in Gaza. One of the speakers last night told us about her grandmother, Selma, born in a beautiful village in Palestine in 1935. When Selma was 13, she and her family were forcibly expelled from their house during the 1948 Nakba, and later, except for the church, all houses and buildings in the village were destroyed. 1935 is also the year before the Great Palestinian Revolt broke out, which lasted from 1936 to 1939. It was put down by the British colonial occupier of Palestine, who in the process significantly weakened the Palestinian capacity to defend themselves, a situation that subsequently helped the Zionist militia and army in their violent takeover of the country. As Afaf Jabiri tells in an interview that appeared in Dutch in Sumut, the magazine of the Dutch Palestine Committee, and there are more copies of this issue there for you if you like to see it. So as she tells in this interview, her own family was expelled from a village called Iraq al-Manshia, forgive my pronunciation, which is located around 30 kilometers from Gaza and was the last village to be occupied and ethnically cleansed in April 1949. The experiences of her grandmother, who lost her husband and son and as a refugee had to raise her 2 daughters by herself, became a personal reference point for Afaf Jabiri's impressive book about Palestinian refugee women from Syria, who after the Syrian revolution were displaced to Jordan. The book is impressive, so I read it, and it's impressive for many reasons, including its theoretical richness and intersectional focus. It argues for a feminist analysis of settler colonialism's epistemic violence, of anti-Palestinianism, a really important concept in the book, to expose the history and geopolitics of intersecting oppressive systems that work through and upon gendered bodies of Palestinian refugee women in humanitarian settings. The book also emphasizes, in Afaf's own words, how closely the Nakba is connected to the daily hardships in the lives of Palestinians. Afaf Jabiri is Senior Lecturer of Development Studies at the University of East London. Her previous book was called Gendered Politics and Law in Jordan, and today's talk is based on her recent book. The full title is Palestinian Refugee Women from Jordan to Syria, Decolonizing the Geopolitics of Displacement. And the book is on sale now if you go to the Bloomsbury website. In the Q&A after the talk, feel free to express your comments or questions in Dutch or Arabic. I'm sure that together we can translate this into English for those who only understand English, or whom that is easier. And there will be drinks afterward, to which you're all warmly invited. There will be a recording. This has been requested by people who couldn't attend. I hope it's okay for everybody. Okay, thank you. The other thing I wanted to say is that there are flyers there of Plant een Olijfboom, which is a very good Dutch organization through which you can also send money to Palestine, or to all sorts of efforts to help people there. I think that was it. So then, thank you all for being here. I should have said that first, but I do it now. Thank you. And then please join me in warmly welcoming our speaker, Afaf Jabiri.
Thank you very much, Francesca, for such a generous introduction. And thank you all for coming today. And thank you for the Institute for hosting this talk. This book was released in January 2024. But when it was released, as you know, the genocidal war against our people in Gaza was started. So I didn't launch it. I didn't do any launch for the book because I didn't want to celebrate anything, even if the book is about Palestine, and even if the book is actually talking about Palestinian refugee women from Syria, and it's very much linked to what's going in Gaza. But for us Palestinian, it's, you know, if you ask any Palestinian, they will tell you that I have a survival guilt. How am I actually standing, talking, eating, breathing, while our people are completely destroyed, killed? A major part of Palestine is disseminated, Gaza, and also other parts of Palestine, historic Palestine in the West Bank, are going through the same thing. So, but recently I've realized that the framework I've used for the book could be actually helpful. And that's when Francesca sent me the email and asked me for this talk. I felt that this could be something that I engage with people to understand why what's going on is going on. And here I'm talking about the silence, the complicity, while the whole world is seeing what we are seeing, and everything is live mainstreamed on the TV and social media, but still there is this question: why? Why wouldn't any government do anything? Why has this been allowed? And we're talking about killing children, killing women, killing men, killing elderly, people running in the streets. Last night in Gaza was a horrific day in the Gaza city, particularly because now the focus is on Gaza city. So I thought through this book, I might be able to link what's going on and might answer some of the questions that we all ask, or many people, particularly those who started to engage with the question of Palestine more closely, asked. So the context of research is on Palestinian refugees from Syria. As you all know, in 2011, a revolution in Syria erupted against the Assad regime. Palestinians in Syria, similar to the Syrian people, were divided. Some were with the revolution, some were with just reform, and some were with the regime itself. But in 2013, there was an attack. The attack against Palestinian refugee camps started. This is the image, and I'm sure you have seen it before. It was after a year of blockade and siege of Yarmouk camp, where Palestinians were trapped for almost a year, without food, without water. Many, many, many people died out of hunger during that time. And this is the case for Yarmouk camp. And Yarmouk camp is, we hear more about it because it was the biggest Palestinian refugee camp in the whole region. But in Dir'a camp, in Halab camp, in other camps around Syria, because there was 12 camps in Syria before the revolution. Some of them still exist, but not with the same capacity. Like Yarmouk camp only hosts 10% of what was before. So there was, when you think about all of these people and how the Palestinian camps were emptied from Palestinians, there was a question: where did they go? We know that most Syrian refugees went to Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon, but this was not the case for Palestinians because they weren't allowed to get into Jordan, they weren't allowed to get into Lebanon, and they were conditioned when they went to Turkey, and not many of them were allowed to get to Turkey. These are images of other Palestinian camps, and also this is the image of how the destruction of Yarmouk camp by the regime and other military groups like ISIS, how they left Yarmouk camp. So basically, Palestinians were not welcome, Palestinian refugees from Syria, in any of these countries, unlike Syrian refugees who around 700,000 entered Jordan. There, of course, were challenges. They weren't completely welcome, but their entry to Jordan was free. In 2013, Jordan issued a strict no-entry policy for Palestinian refugees from Syria. So before 2013, there was a case-by-case assessment. So the customs will assess the case, and if it depends on the customs mentality, politics, blah, they might make them enter or not. But in 2013, it was a very strict policy of no entry to Palestinian refugees. And during this time, I was doing some consultancy with UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Agency for Palestine Refugees. And I met with a group of Palestinian humanitarian workers who were working in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon, and in Palestine itself. And after the workshops and the formal kind of trainings and work I was doing with them, we used to sit down in the evening and talk. And I'm a Palestinian, I'm a refugee. I was born and raised in a Palestinian camp. But still, it kind of shocked me when I was kind of listening to their talk, as if there was a competition actually between countries and which one is the worst for Palestinian refugees. And I used to kind of just put my hands like this and listen to them with a shock. And while we were talking, there was this question of, or there was an answer. Every time somebody asked, but why? The answer would be because they are Palestinians. And we will all agree, like as if that was something, we all understand it, what was it? But I then thought about it. What does it mean when we say because they are Palestinian? So do we, as Palestinians, do we understand it in the same way? And when we say it to people, do people really understand what we mean by that? And that was what triggered this research for the book. I wanted to understand what, when Palestinians say, because we are Palestinians, they meant. And there was this humanitarian worker who said this: nowadays, nothing worse than being a Palestinian refugee from Syria. His mother died out of hunger in Yarmouk camp. And I actually opened the book. This was the opening line of my book. At the time when I wrote the book, I thought that was true. At that time, there was nothing worse than being a Palestinian refugee from Syria. But by the time the book was released, there was actually worse, which is being Palestinian in Gaza. So I went through a lot of discussion with those humanitarian workers, and I acknowledge in my book that actually they were the ones who gave me my theoretical understanding, who pushed me to think of it from the perspective of the people themselves. So I didn't get a theoretical framework from certain theories. It is them who established this idea. If we want to think about something, that we need to get it out of the people. And this statement was repeated more and more by women. When I started my field research and started interviewing Palestinian refugee women who were living in Jordan illegally, they were all saying that these conditions they are facing because they are Palestinian. So taking this statement as a departure point for my research has, for me, meanings at the methodological and the theoretical level. The first, that any study of Palestinian refugee women must center the Nakba, because that's what they meant when they said, because we are Palestinian. They meant what happened in 1948. And when they thought of Nakba, and I have a whole chapter about the Palestinian condition in the book, in terms of how do women think about their Palestinianism. Something is not related to nationalism, never in the sense actually of nationalism. It was in the sense of justice, thinking of Palestinianism in terms of what happened and in terms of how that should be corrected. And mostly the correction is related to their right of return. So basically, the Nakba for them was something that is ongoing. Many of them second generation, third generation, they did not witness the Nakba itself. But whenever you ask them about their journey or any kind of question, they wouldn't start from where they were. Like when we arrived to Jordan or when we were in Syria, they will tell you, because my family came from Safad, which is a city in the north of Palestine. And they will tell me the story of their families. And after telling me the story of their families and the journey, how many camps they have been, what they went through, and then they will connect that with their own stories. So basically, the Nakba was something that is ongoing. The Nakba, that is something that is endless for them, because they have connected their stories to the stories of their parents. So, and when I studied the Palestinian refugee women in Jordan, for me, Jordan was an example. I did not think of Jordan as the only country. As I said earlier, there is a competition between countries of who would restrict the lives of Palestinians more in the region. But I thought of it as an example to think about not Jordan as a state that is independent from the settler colonial project in Palestine. It should be linked, and this link should be established. So when we think of the West right now, what they are doing in terms of suppressing freedom of expression, or it has to be thought of in relation to the settler colonial project in Palestine. So to connect these things, because in my book, I deal with settler colonialism as a transnational system. So it extends beyond Palestine, and it extends beyond the suppression of Palestinians to suppress also the supporters of the Palestinian. And I define this system and settler colonialism, which has mechanisms. It operates through mechanisms. One of the mechanisms is the anti-Palestinianism. And anti-Palestinianism, of course, been theorized and addressed by the work of Edward Said. In my book, I use Edward Said's work and I acknowledge it, and I define settler anti-Palestinianism in the form like a settler colonial framework that normalizes Palestinian displacement, erases their history, silences their narrative, and subject them to structural and epistemic violence. So this is how I look at anti-Palestinianism in the book. And if you can take this definition, apply it to any case, you will see the unique or the particularity of each country or region or in relation to the suppression of Palestinian in that context. So basically the book focus is in 3 or 4 questions. The first, how is settler colonial epistemic violence of anti-Palestinianism reinforced in Jordan's nationalism and UN refugee governance system? This is kind of the overall question of my book. How these frameworks produce exclusionary practices that affect Palestinian refugees' lives and rights and perpetuate colonial continuity by positioning Palestinians in a state of hardship. How these structural and geopolitics dynamics separate gender-based violence within Palestinian community, particularly among refugee women from Syria and Jordan. And in the book, I study in depth issues related to sexual violence, issues related to gender violence. But in order to understand it in the right way, these issues need to be analyzed from the point of structural and epistemic violence against Palestinians as a whole, before we get to talk about gender-based violence. Because we see right now that how most feminists are silenced about what's going on in Gaza and in Palestine in general. But if there was a case of the so-called honor crime, you will see them all speaking publicly about this. You will see so many statements going out. You will see even maybe presidents of certain states talking about issues related when it comes to culture. But when it comes to the political, the right to life, more than any other rights, then we see the silence. And this is something I did in the book, that we cannot really talk about gender-based violence or sexual violence without understanding its context, the context which is the structural and epistemic violence against Palestinians. Because for Palestinians women, when I engaged with them, they didn't define themselves first as a woman, first. They defined themselves as Palestinians, first, as refugees, second, as other categories, and then women. So basically, it's important when we think about how do women define themselves, not in terms of gender. Gender could be very useful in understanding the lived reality of women, but not alone. We lose so much if we just take the point of gender without politicizing it, without historicizing it, and without putting it into context. And in this context, we need to put the gender issues from within the settler colonial system, because we need to understand also how this system has affected the Palestinian social and political and economic and every single aspect of Palestinian fabric. So we cannot just understand the cultural issues in Palestine without that context. We lose the point. So for me, this was very important in order to understand why women, if you ask them about issues related to gender-based violence, they will talk about Palestine, especially women in the camp. And those researchers, and we have one of them today, Annalise Moore here. She studied and had a lot of work with Palestinians in Palestine and elsewhere, and know that it's always Palestine because they understand their context. They understand that is the story where we always need to begin. It's not that we love history, but there are moments in history that you cannot just forget and negate. You will lose it all. So basically, that also gave me the understanding that I cannot start from the middle. I need to start from where women start. And women always started from, as I said, from 1948. They always started from their condition as a Palestinian, and then they think of these conditions in relation to their gender. And the other issue, the other important issue, which I will give an example about it. Now we are going to model a decolonial feminist research ethic and offer methodological blueprint for future scholarship on gender and Palestinian refugees and Palestine more broadly. We see that, in any case, you can speak freely. Neutrality has no place. Objectivity is done in the right way. Or I don't know if there is a right way to do it. But when it comes to Palestine, people always start from, to show that they are neutral. They use this term Israel/Palestine, which is very confusing for me. Is this one country, two countries? What do you mean by it? But it's a safe way of studying Palestine, just to say that I'm also considering the other aspect. But here we're thinking about, Palestine and Israel. We are thinking of colonized relationship. And if you put this relationship in one, I don't know how you do it. The whole research is, I don't know how they do it. But this is one of the ethical issues. Why would you always associate the colonized with the colonizer's knowledge and with the ways in which you kind of try to justify your engagement with Palestine? So this is one of the ethical issues. I engage with it in the book through looking into how feminists studied the Syrian refugees crisis, because there is a huge body of literature now about Syrian refugee and gender issues. Nowhere except the few places that I mentioned in the book, Palestinians were mentioned. Most of the time as a footnote. Only a footnote. There is also some refugees. I met some refugees, but not in the text. And what does this tell us about feminist work? When feminism is to challenge universalism, but not in the case of Palestine. So when they study any case, they don't look at the particularities. One of the main methodological contribution of feminists is not to generalize, not to universalize, and to take into consideration the context, and not to create central figures. So why in the study of Syrian refugees, there is a central figure, the Syrian refugee or the Syrian refugee women, without looking at different categories. And here, not only Palestinians, by the way, because in Syria, there was a big number of Iraqi refugees. There are the Kurds. There are multiple people, multiple kinds of of women categories absent from feminists because they don't want to engage, because the Palestinian women and Palestinian refugees, their numbers are huge in Syria. And you cannot do a research with Palestinian refugees without encountering a Palestinian. So to kind of escape engaging with Palestine, they have universalized about the question of Syria as a whole. So the framework I'm using for the book, and I'm thinking about the relationship between Nakba and epistemic violence. And I'm using Spivak concept of epistemic violence and what she calls subjugative knowledge. And this subjugative knowledge, when I apply it to the Nakba, it represents a site of epistemic violence where the suppression of Palestinian and their narrative has been institutionalized and normalized. So here we're not talking, if we want to understand why what's happening in Gaza is happening today, it is because of this history of normalization of Palestinian suffering. It's because of this history where we become very much familiar with Palestinian displacement, protracted, thinking about Palestinians as UNRWA's refugees, as Palestinians who are displaced. It becomes so familiar that people forget that we need to do something about it. And this familiarity is a form of epistemic violence. It is a violence in itself because it produces some sort of normality and does not think of those people as a human being, because no human being should live in a kind of displacement for almost now 8 decades. And again, much of the literature on Palestinian refugees either superficially reference the Nakba as a footnote or treat it as a secondary perspective. So if you look at the literature, except, of course, there are some exceptions, but generally, the Nakba will be summarized in a paragraph or so. And that's in the best situation. And then they will focus more on the conditions, the economic condition of Palestinian refugees and the geographical location, whether in Jordan, Lebanon, etc. So, and somewhere along the way, the Nakba wouldn't be the kind of the guiding aspect of the lives of those people. And I'll give you here an example also of worse literature. Some literature that normalizes the narrative of the Zionism, particularly about Nakba. And I'm using here, and it's just an example, because there are many, and I mentioned them in the book. Irfan's work on refugees, which is called Refugee and Resistance, Palestinian and the International Refugee System. When she defined the Nakba, it defined it as follows. Nakba as displacement and dispossession of more than 750,000 Palestinians from 1947 to 1949, which is fine. And she describes it as one of the most consequential and controversial and contested events in modern history. This is how she saw the Nakba. And I'll get to analyze this very more. So when she talked about the flight of Palestinians from a gender perspective, she used I don't know if you are familiar with the case of Deir Yassin. Deir Yassin, it's a massacre, that's one of the first massacres that happened in 1947. So she used that, and there were so many kind of what happened, particularly in relation to rape to women, spread in the surrounding villages. And it frightened, of course, the Palestinian population that something like this could happen. And there could be some people left just because of this. But this is not what many Palestinian historians have documented of why Palestinians left. Like in case of my family, there was a blockade and siege from October 1948 until April 1949. My grandparents reached a stage where there was nothing, no water, they bombed everything. So they did not leave just because they were frightened from. So she generalizes this issue. So you uses gender issues in order to support Zionist claims that Palestinians have left on their own, and we didn't do anything about it. And this is a book on refugees. So here we can see that there is shifting the blame from the what happens and the killing, the destruction of what happened in 1948 from the Zionist militia at the time, the Haganah and others, to the Palestinian gender norms. And this is how gender is twisted in this case, in order to actually support the Zionist claim. So basically, such kind of work, and this is again an example. I'm not talking this is all, but this kind of work should raise ethical issues. It's not just about contesting the work itself. Nakba has been documented. The Palestinians have been talking about the Nakba. So it's the history of my mother. It's the history of my uncles. It's the history of our neighbors. It's the history that is something that people have lived. So when it's that history, it's the history of the colonization, of the colonized people. And then you talk about it as something controversial, something that could be contested, from which point of view? So who contests this? If she says that the Zionists contest this, it's controversial for some Zionists who, that's okay. If she acknowledges who contests such kind of thing, but to put it as a blunt statement, and it's actually, you can find it in so many other works, not just in this. So basically, this is part of the epistemic violence. This is an epistemic violence because epistemic violence has two sides. The first is the epistemological, and the second is the material harmful. And both are very much interrelated to each other because the physical and the material is most of the time something results from the epistemology itself. And that we don't give it much. So here we see that a very good example of how failing to center subaltern knowledge, specifically when it challenges dominant narrative, risk upholding the same colonial structures the colonial research aims to dismantle. So instead of dismantling such kind of knowledge, we are reproducing this knowledge. And of course, using the gender aspect is make it even more problematic. So I took the mission of defining the Nakba. And I know it has been defined in so many other, and mostly in most of Palestinians work on the Nakba and the history. In some part, I'm not doing something new. I'm just collecting some of the work in order to bring something as to frame the analysis and to be, you know, for me, and this book took a lot of time for a reason that because I'm a refugee, and because when I started reading about refugees and Palestinian refugees myself, sometimes I was so upset. I was so angry. How those people come to our houses, take the knowledge from us, and then twist it and do something completely different with it. So I was very much afraid. Although I'm Palestinian, though I'm a refugee, although I have lived, not similar, but almost similar conditions like them, but still I was very much afraid. It was a big responsibility to take all of these stories, and they told me more than they would tell any other researcher. Basically, when they knew that I was born in a Palestinian camp, so they would be very much familiar with me. I'm not just a researcher, I'm one of them. So that was, for me, a very big responsibility. It took a lot of time for me to find the framework, although you find it simple now, but it took a lot of time because of that responsibility, because of that trust, and because of my feelings of anger, of how people represented me in so much of the literature that I disagreed with. So basically, the first, which is, you will find it familiar, which is the work of Ilyas Khouri, concept of the Nakba as a continuous. And this, I wanted to bring it in conversation with Nakba as a juncture point in history. For Khoury, he argues that the Nakba is not merely a historical event confined to 1948, but an enduring process, a living condition marked by occupation and exile. So for Ilyas Khoury, the word that encapsulates life under occupation and refugee camps, this is the Nakba. This is how it's ongoing. But this is, again, as I said, this is the definition that is known for Nakba. To expand that definition, I used Constantin Zureik's work, The Meaning of Nakba. Constantin Zureik wrote that book in 1948, The Meaning of Nakba. And in his book, he tried to understand the Nakba. He is the one who coined the Nakba. So the Nakba, as we know it, the term is coined by Constantin Zureik himself. So I wanted to know, how did he actually understood the Nakba at the time when he coined the term? And he expanded what we understand from a Nakba, and the meaning of a Nakba in his work and its significance is beyond Palestine. For Constantin Zureik, framing it as a global crisis with implication for international law, human rights, and global politics. So for Zureik, he analyzes a Nakba in its context. What is the context, the political context, the historical context of a Nakba? Now, there was this post-World War II, where we have this new world of emancipation, freedom, self-determination, decolonization, people rise particularly to self-determination and human rights and equality, and all these kind of lovely concepts that were created at the time. While that was created, there was something else created, which is a Nakba of Palestinian. So the way, and he looks at it from actually the 1922, from the establishment of the British mandate over Palestine in the League of Nations in 1922, where the League of Nations approved Britain's plan to, and promise, the Balfour Promise of Palestine as a homeland for the Jews. So for the League of Nations to approve such a colonial project, for Zureik is a betrayal, is a failure of the system in and by itself. So this is the first thing. The second thing, he's discussing the 1947 partition plan. In the partition plan, the partition plan divided Palestine for two, one for the Jews and one for Palestinians. At the time, Palestinians were over 90% of the population. Jews were less than 10%. And take a note that Jews weren't just the Jews who were immigrating and the settler immigrant Jews. We have Palestinian Jews. So sometimes when they put the percentage of Jews, they think of them as a whole. But this is wrong. We have to know that there were Palestinian Jews at the time who normally, as Christians and Muslims, they owned land. And those weren't disputing. Those weren't part of that division. I'm not generalizing, not all of them, but I mean, they were part of the Palestinian fabric completely. So when we say about that, even the 10%, we have to think about it in terms of who was genuinely Palestinian Jews at the time, and they owned land because of their historical connection to Palestine, and those who were European settler immigrants who came to Palestine and owned nothing in Palestine. So this partition plan gave Jews 54% of Palestine, and Palestinian 46%. So basically, Palestinian got less than half of what they owned. And this is by United Nations. The same entity that established the Geneva Conventions, the human rights declarations, and at the same level. So Constantin Zureyx, look at these cases, look at the contradictions, look at how is it at the same time you were coding human rights and equality and all of these principles, but actually literally stealing something from people and giving it to another people. So he sees this as a betrayal of their own arguments, and that was the Nakba. That was the catastrophe, or that was one of the meaning of Nakba for Constantin Zureyx. So Nakba was not just for Palestinian. Nakba was for the world. This is the Nakba of the world. This is a catastrophe for the whole world, who actually at the time of where we were moving into a new era that characterized by human rights and equality, we maintained discrimination, more than discrimination, what happened to Palestinians. We maintained this kind of colonial logic in Palestine. So, and I kind of rephrase it, but the catastrophe of the world's moral order lies in the of global morality and justice when Palestinians are normalized as displaced population with no political rights. And the second, there are several ways in which I can't go into every single meaning of the work, but one of it that before 1948, the world was thinking about the displacement of the Jews as a form of immorality, which was, of course. But when it came to Palestinian, it was defined as an existing condition for Palestinian. So the moral aspect was taken. It was categorized normally as fine. Palestinians are displaced. So and creating a displaced population that would live in a protracted case all the time. From this understanding of Nakba and from Khoury, I came to the understanding that we need to understand Nakba as a juncture point in history. And again, I use the work of Stuart Hall. And Stuart Hall, who is a Caribbean, one of the central kind of intellectuals and figure in cultural studies, he coined this term juncture point to describe certain moments in the history. And these moments are particular. They are the moments created to connect the past and the future by keeping something related to the past. So Palestine in this case is the connection between the past and the present, the connection between colonialism and the age of enslavement and colonialism and Western empire, and its continuity. So basically, Palestine is the continuity of such an age. So by this, that it will never end. Western control, Western domination, Western power over the world will continue through the case of Palestine. And from here, we think about why Palestine is a juncture point in history, the Nakba itself, because if there was no Nakba, there would be no so many cases or massacres that happened not just in Palestine, even in other countries. Because Nakba kind of legitimized, gave some legitimacy to the presence of the colonialism, to the continuity of presence of colonialism in other aspects. As long as the principle of a settler colonial project exists, it gives justification, gives legitimacy to other cases to continue. So basically, it is the continuity of the past logic in the present time. And that logic, you see it today when you think about, some people don't want to talk about genocide in Gaza, don't want to mention the word genocide in Gaza, because the logic still exists. And their understanding of Palestine and of what happened in 1948, in contesting it, normalizing it, and thinking of it as something it's kind of normal to happen for the whole entire population to be uprooted and replaced by another population who do not belong to the to the land or to, I have 5 minutes, which is a very hard. So again, as I said, when I thought, this is the theoretical frame where I have how I looked at the case of Jordan. And this is for me very important to be understood, because I don't want only to think about Jordan as if Jordan is the only country. Jordan is one of the countries that work within this transnational system of settler colonialism in the world. But what I studied as the case for Jordan is, how do we study the strict 2013 no entry policy for Palestinian refugees from Syria? As you know, over 50% of the population of Jordan population are Palestinian. So why would 20, 30, 50,000 Palestinians be a problem? How do we understand this? This was very important question in the book. And in order to do this, I have to go back to the history, and have to go to the history particularly of categorization. How Jordan used, in each political moment, categorized Palestinian differently. Before 1948, during 1948, in 1967, in 1970, which is the Black September in Jordan, where the Palestinian labor organization and the Jordanian army were in. It was another massacre of Palestinians in the camps in Jordan. So I had to do timeline of Jordan history with Palestine in order to understand actually some of the cases. I wanted to introduce some of the Palestinian women cases, because it is through these cases that I actually understood the context of Jordan. I knew the history. But in order for the history to be relevant to the present, it's through life story. And these life stories in the book, they would give us the history. So I historicized Jordan through going kind of doing timeline for women's lives. And I found out that you can't just think about the relationship. And this is one of the questions when we study refugees. Why refugees have chosen to come to Netherlands, for example, not to go to UK. So I found out that the relationship between those who came to Jordan, Palestinian, that most of them actually were Jordanian before. Most of them have close relationship with Jordan, but particularly being Jordanian. Jordanian women were imprisoned in Cyber City camp, which is, they call it camp, but it was a form of prison, because they do have the nationality, but their husbands had the Palestinian travel document. So even if they were Jordanian, they were allowed to enter, but they were allowed to enter on their own, leaving their kids, leaving their husband. They didn't do it. So they ended up Jordanian women. They ended up being in detention center in their own countries. And that explains a lot about the case. The other thing I study in the book, which is the denial of humanitarian assistance and aid to Palestinian refugees from Syria and Jordan. And to understand this, I had to go back to Nakba as well, to see how the Palestinians were actually the only population in the world who was singled out of the refugee conventions, that the refugee conventions does not apply to the Palestinian case. And that left a protection gap. And you see how this issue in the refugee convention is actually impacting the lives of women in Jordan, Palestinian women in Jordan during this day. But more, I think I also look at the practices of a humanitarian organization like International Migration Organization, UNFPA, which is United Nations Fund for Population, and others who work on gender-based violence. Not only they excluded women from kind of a humanitarian assistance, but even gender-based violence protection and empowerment programs. There were conditions on women's NGOs in Jordan of only to accept Syrian refugees and Jordanians, not to accept anyone without these categories. So all of these cases would show us how the Palestinian refugee women in Jordan, there were so many layers of violence and discrimination against them. And I'm happy to discuss further in the discussion. And thank you very much.
Thank you, first of all, Afaf, for a very rich talk. As I think you've already heard what a fantastic book this is, because all of these things are in there, and then, of course, in much more detail. It's really very impressive, and I learned many things from your book, of course. One of the things that was, I mean, it's so fundamental and so, for me, unknown, and I think for many people, which is indeed that the Palestinian refugees do not fall under the 1951 Convention or Human Rights Commission, and therefore miss basic rights, including the right to return, which is a right for refugees, which they don't have. It's just one fundamental thing, and I think it also shows that this is all so big, and yet maybe more of us know so little about it because of all of the things you also discussed. So maybe there are comments, questions. Again, feel free to ask them in different languages if you prefer. And maybe also, if you want to introduce yourself, just your name. Go ahead. You want to? I think it's better to use the mic. You have another one. Is it okay?
Can I have paper?
Yes.
Start with that one, and then
It's okay. It's okay.
I think you can. Okay. Yes. And take this also. Sorry.
sorry, these are empty.
Okay, then. So how do you? Okay.
I'm a patient woman, don't worry, take your time. And thank you very much, Dr. Jabiri, for coming in this difficult time and sharing your knowledge and this incredible work you've done. I'm sure it's not easy to talk about these things all the time. I really was struck by how apt your comment is that this framework can really be applied and elaborated in terms of what's happening in Gaza, not least in terms of this whole talk of where are we going to send these new displaced people? And they're negotiating with some country here and some country there, but they won't take them, but they will. And there's this kind of like, oh, well, of course they'll be displaced also, as if that's normalized. Yeah. And I'd really welcome your comments in that regard of how we can think about what this means, and in regards to how this normalization of what you're drawing on Said in terms of anti-Palestinian racism, how that normalization fits into the larger normalization of Zionism and its violences.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. You answered, because again, there is no logic to how they are discussing plans, and they call it several things, evacuation, and all the news kind of use the same terminology of evacuation. This is not evacuation. This is kind of an ethnic cleansing. And until we use the right terminology for what's going on in Palestine, and right now it's a genocide. So to normalize what's going on in Gaza is a result of decades of normalization. I know things started to be different here in the West, and we were talking just before the even today, that it's still small, it's still slow. The things are changing, and people are kind of awakening. It would have been okay if there was no genocide in Gaza for this process to be slow. But when we see people are treated as completely dehumanized, think of them like you can move them north, south, middle, or even outside of the country, or discussing the issue of the humanitarian aid in the negotiation. Some of the things that are normalized, for example, when they were talking about the negotiation process, and because I'm in the West, I kind of have to, this is another layer of torture that you go through. Listen to the news and see how they normalize negotiating aid, which is a war crime. It's a war crime to negotiate aid. Assassination is a war crime. There is no justification to kill journalists, even if they belong to Hamas, even if they are members of Hamas. It's still, they are, as journalists, they are not fighters. They are not engaged directly in the fight. So this is again a war crime. Anybody, even Hamas senior leaders, who were targeted in Doha, this is still a war crime. You cannot, assassination is a war crime, and period. But this is not the case for Palestine. In other cases, that would be safe, because the Geneva Convention is very clear, unless they are engaged in the fight. And they also forget another thing about Palestine, which is normalized, which is that Palestinian as a whole, including armed resistance, are civilians, because they are under occupation. But nobody mentions this, because there has been a normalization of Palestinian as being terrorists. And they shouldn't fight. They should just accept being killed. So this kind of normalization, not only just moving people, dehumanization, the whole issue of Palestine is addressed in a wrong way. So you can't just go and kill people as you wish. Where does this happen? Okay, the United States does this. And now the settler colonial state of Israel gives its right, the same right to itself as being the police of the world, and that is okay. If this is normalized, the impact and effect on the world would be huge, because this is another juncture point. We are living in another very critical, important moment in history. So now, if this normalizes that any state can claim to do justice in its own hands, now the world is, again, would be something else. So normalization now is going even beyond the question of Nakba and other things. Normalization now on what Israel has rights and its conduct and how it could do these things, which we can see particularly in the Western media, quite become normalized as if this is not, some of the crimes that are normalized are actually crimes against the humanity. Crimes against, so yeah, I don't know if I answered your question or not, but of course it can be applied in this situation. And this is why I kind of decided in this talk to focus more on the framework rather than the details of the book.
Thank you very much for this talk. My name is Notion too. I would like to ask you maybe a technical question about the work. You spoke about the responsibility you felt working with your own people, and I'm very interested in this tension or this dilemma one faces when one does research in communities like Palestinian communities in diaspora, when research does more harm than good, and so on. And I would like to ask you, is this tension visible in the work? Did you have a relationship approach to research? Was the work itself slow, or you meant that you had sometimes when you were not able to write? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. It's not technical. This is part of the theoretical underpinning of the research itself, actually. And it started maybe long before this book. It started when I was doing my PhD. I did my PhD at SOAS. So I was kind of lucky because SOAS is an environment where activism is accepted, and also with activists and feminists who are similar to me. But to my politics, I meant. But still, you know, when you come from an activism background, you are not confident enough. And when you start reading all of these kinds of beautiful articles and complex language, you know, all of these things, you become really feeling that as if you have insecurity, like as a researcher. And this insecurity, I didn't like it because it was like not something like me when I was doing my PhD. And I did the book, and in the book I talked about positionality, but at the same time, at that time, I actually accepted what was there, thinking about the outsider-insider issue, for example, and challenged a bit the literature, but still thought of myself from within this paradigm. I'm not completely outsider, but I'm not also completely insider. But then I thought about it, and I wrote an article about just this thing, the positionality. And I thought about this kind of division, and this is another binary of thinking about myself. Why do I have to think about myself a lot when I'm going to do my research? Specifically, when I'm doing to do research with people I'm very familiar with a situation. I should have used my activism in doing research. I should have, particularly the context I did my research on the issue of guardianship over women, which is something that is not, at the time, was not welcomed, because this was dealt with as sacred issue for the government. And anyway, so I didn't actually use what I could have done in the research because of this insecurity. Now, when I did some of this, of course, related to when I did my research with Palestinian refugee women, and it was different. I used this time my activism. I took the case to the United Nations during CSW and during the CEDAW, which is the Convention for Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. I wrote a report about the situation of women based on my research, and I presented the case. And we got out of this a recommendation for Jordan to close Cyber City Detention Center, and it was closed after that. So that's how I learned from the research, that I can't go to my research just thinking about who am I and what am I doing? And all of these things that we read in the literature that you have to take into consideration. And I did my research during this time through activism and through dialogue with organizations as well. And I did several workshops and interviews, which weren't really interviews. And I gave a section about this in the book because I also wanted to share this experience. I always appreciate that, you know, when I did my PhD, I needed a lot of kind of discussion around this issue to read how people felt, how did they do in these. And there is a growing body of literature around these issues, which is very important. But also this question of doing activism while you are doing research hasn't been yet kind of developed, because we still think of this part of us as activists as being less of an academic. And the other issue is the issue of trust. I'm a Palestinian, and I'm critical of so much work on Palestine. And am I going to do justice to the stories of women? So you feel like you are carrying the weight of these stories. I spent more than a year, couldn't write because of the pain of what, those people who were living in Palestinian camps, some of them before the Cyber City Detention Center was closed, they were in a very horrible situation. Like even if they had cancer, for example, they would take them to the treatment. And if they were absent for 5 minutes, they would threaten them with deportation. And deportation was happening all the time. So they lived really in fear all the time. They were living in fear all the time. They sometimes didn't tell other people that they were Palestinians. So they concealed their identity. They represented themselves as being Syrian. But being in Jordan, it's very difficult to do this because we kind of know the different dialects between Syrian and Palestinians and how much you can try. Sometimes you will be. So, and there were some of the stories I tell in the book about sexual violence of even children, because like one of the stories, she was a girl and her father was affiliated with one of the Palestinian factions, and he was killed. And but her mother and father were divorced, so she was living with her stepmother. Her stepmother was a Syrian. So because she was a Syrian, she could actually flee the country and take her children with her, claiming that they were Syrian. So the border control, they believed her. But then this child was left alone. And the journey, there were so many, she was faced with so many, she was exposed to so many violence and sexual violence. But then the only way they can get her to her grandparents in Jordan is through commissioning somebody to go to Lebanon, conduct marriage, like have a fake marriage contract, and bring her to Jordan. And this person started to manipulate the whole family, wanted more money, didn't want to divorce her. And she was just a child. We're talking about a child. So when you think about these cases of why this child had to go through this, why wasn't she allowed to come back to enter Jordan normally like her siblings? She had grandparents there. Another story of a mother who lost her daughter in the sea because she couldn't get her to come to Jordan. So her father arranged for her to go to somewhere in Europe in one of those boats, and she lost her life. There were these stories, very, very difficult stories and how you are going to tell them without only thinking about this suffering as well. Mm-hmm. And how are you going to tell them and also keeping the agency of these women, because they weren't just sitting there and crying. They were doing so many things. So basically how to balance between showing their stories and what they have been through, the horrific, really horrific conditions, and some stories on the customs, on the border control also. And at the same time, show their resilience and show this balance between the two. Like you don't want to romanticize that they were only resisting or victims being victims and suffering, and etc. That was also a very difficult way to deal with it, particularly because there was cruelty, very horrific situation. So that's why it took very long time, from around 2014 until 2021. Hope I answered.
Yes.
My name is Petra. Thank you so much for coming here and telling us all these things and more background to this horrific thing which we all, well, all, I, really think about every day. I've got a few questions, but maybe that's part. You might have answered the questions during your presentation, but I may not have registered it correctly. So my question is, you argue, as I understand it, that the whole human rights frame, the Palestinians are outside the human rights frame, more or less, more. And so that's in itself interesting. It's not interesting, but it's an issue to ask, how is that possible? And well, the two questions that follow from this is, for me, it's one is, do you think that Palestinian women are more outside the human rights framework than Palestinian men? And secondly, is this this lack of rights of Palestinians to human rights discourse and the war crime discourse and so on, is it somewhere really encoded in the sense that, for example, take the Geneva Convention, that's not in the Geneva Convention is a general statement. It doesn't say, well, it states
not state by state,
but it doesn't make a difference between Palestinians and other refugees, for example. So, how do you see that? Is that being outside this human rights discourse? Is it something also written down, or at least to be found in the discourse of the United Nations or whatever? Do you understand my question?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I do.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, Palestinians were left out of the entire human rights system, because the one of the main principles of the Vienna Convention and others, the right to self-determination at the time. You know, we were at the time of where people had to determine what they want. But what happened in Palestine was completely the opposite. So remember, like the late 40s, beginning of 50s and 60s, mostly it was about decolonization and people, and it's done in Palestine in a completely different way than the nation-state system they have established. Because what was that nation-state system? And of course, we do have critique of the nation-state system, and they have created, but still that nation-state system, even their own understanding of the nation-state system, that it should include everybody. Everybody. So here we're thinking about the question of diversity. So Palestinian community was a very diverse community. You have the Christians, you have the Muslims, you have the Jews, you have the different also ethnicities, we have the Arabs, non-Arabs, a community that for thousands of years here, we're talking about just 100 years or more than 1,000 years, we're living in harmony together. A very good example of how people exist together, not coexist. Like now they are talking about coexistence. Like why we talk about coexistence when we had existence? That was the nature of our existence, that to be together as Jews, Christians, Muslims, atheists, whatsoever. So what they have done by creating the settler colonial project in Palestine, that's called Israel, is that they destroyed that diversity, destroyed it, and replaced it with a state that claims just only based on religion, only. So you have a community that was exemplary, not just in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria as well, like all the Levant area. This is the nature of that area in terms of the diversity of that region, in terms of Christians, Muslims. And you replace it with an ethnocentric state. And that again created the same uh, um, the same example in the region. Because if you create this form of nationalism based on one ethnic group or religion, if you want to compete with neighboring countries, they also had to create their own in order to be able to compete with you in the region. So this whole kind of narrow sense of nationalism in the region created by the creation of Israel. So it's also established, if you look here in Netherlands or in UK now or anywhere, this narrow sense of nationalism defining by certain criteria. Would this be the case if we don't have a state that is celebrated based on its religious grounds? I don't know, but I think it would be difficult to kind of still advocate for, in an age like this age, still advocate for an exclusionary politics when you think about nationalism in each state. So it's not only Palestinians were singled out and left out of the human rights. Palestine was used as an example, as a way forward for the continuity of colonial power, not only in the outside of their countries, but also inside of their countries. This idea of the English, the Dutch, I don't know what, and excluding everyone else. Humans generally, naturally like diversity. So things like this is very important for us to go back and see what this project has created. And that's what Constantin Zureik studied in the meaning of Nakba. That the Nakba is going to be on the whole world. It's not just Palestine, because of the ethos, principles, and the things that were left out or contradicted or established through the establishment of this settler. Because that's why there is no way outside of dismantling the system. You need to dismantle the system and rebuild, you know. And when we think about our feminism, feminists, they don't think about one state or two states, because this whole state aspect is problematic. You think of liberation, of ending injustice, and then we think together of how, for example, Palestine can be used to recreate a new world, really. A new world where all of these oppression systems, sexism, racism, classism, you cannot, Palestine is not a case to fight it just in Palestine. It's a case that you need to fight it globally. It's very much linked, capitalism, all of these systems, they need to be connected. And there is a future for this. Now you can see it happening in the world. There is a future. Now your question, I'm sorry, I went on this topic. Yeah, of course, there are differences between how women and men are experiencing these exclusionary practices by UN and Jordan. Some of these, and of course, the harsher the condition of displacement, the more there are gender-based violence committed. But there was something interesting, and I discuss it in something called masculinist restoration, masculinist maneuvering. And I also use Denise Kandayati, and she's one of post-colonial feminists, term masculinist restoration. The interesting thing that men, Palestinian refugee men, were not allowed to leave the house, because if they were caught, they will immediately be deported to Syria. So basically women were more able to go to work because also there is gender understanding here from the government and police. They don't do identity check for women. So they were in a more privileged position in terms of holding kind of the family's finance and working as nannies, working in salons, hairdressers, in the neighborhood. So their mobility and movement was freer than men. But what was interesting that they did not want to use this leverage. They didn't want to use this power they had economically. They used they were trying to re-empower their husbands, giving them the money, asking them to take the decisions. And I got into discussion with women. At first, it was like really, it was very conflicting for me to think about this issue. Is it that our women kind of cannot be economically empowered and they go to men and give them money? And I had this discussion with some feminists, Jordanian and Palestinian feminists in Jordan. And they were like, you can't talk about this. It will show that women are kind of against their own empowerment. And I said, why wouldn't we think about it in a different way? Those women, they are witnessing a huge discrimination against their husbands, first because they are Palestinian, and second because they are men. And is it the time now for women to rebel against their husbands? Some of them actually did, but I'm talking about the general. It was a noble position that you have the power, but you don't use it. And it's, again, another example of when sometimes you politicize what's going on. So they know that the Palestinian man would feel degraded if they don't have money. But also they know that if those men went out, pushed to work, they will go out, then they will lose them. They will go to Syria. And some of them, when they were deported to Syria, they were killed. So the price was high. So women were balancing between making their husbands pay a high price or actually restoring their masculinity, making them feel good about themselves in certain situations. This is one way in which I studied gender during this time.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you again. It is, I saw one more hand, and I think it's time. And we have heard so much from you, and we've also answered the questions, so so much depth. So thank you for everything. I think we're all very grateful.
Thank you very much
to you for coming. So just again to recommend the book, because all of this is in the book and much more, including so many of these women's agency, the various ways. And this didn't come through so much in the talk as is in the book. So I just wanted to mention that. Yeah. The interview with Afaf is there. There are flyers for Planting a Life Bombing with Wings downstairs. Thank you.
6th of October, the next.
And the next event in the Palestine in Focus series is October the 6th. You can find the theme online. But it's fantastic. That you have so much energy, and it was really very.
Towards the end, there was
brilliant.
a bit.
No, fantastic lecture. Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Really,
Thank you.
amazing.
Thanks.